Hi, welcome to Hollywood Crime Scene. This is Rachel Fisher.
Hi, this is Desi Jedeikin.
First, we're just going to start off by thanking our most recent Patreon contributors. Thank you guys so much. This week we had Amy Beth, we had Allison, Lorian, Madeline, Joshua, Brenda, Dan, Stacy, Jeff, and Sage today, and Marlene.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. If you'd like to donate and listen to our bonus content that we have up there, it's patreon.com/Hollywood Crime Scene.
So, Rachel, did you watch the latest episode of, The Assassination of Gianni Versace?
I did.
This show is a mess.
It's a fucking mess. And I was trying to give it the benefit of the doubt last week when we did a recap.
Right. But it took even a further step back for me this week.
Yeah. I just feel like I don't like the non-linear storytelling in this particular instance.
Right.
I don't mind non-linear storytelling when it's effective, but I don't feel like there's any sort of merit to it.
No.
Being this way.
And there's also a problem for me with the fantasy versus reality. There's no real clear-cut delineation between the two.
Right.
I just am never, if I didn't know the case very well, I would be more confused than I am.
Right.
But because I do, I feel like I'm able to be like, hey.
I just also feel like there were also some like pretty blatant sort of American Psycho ripoffs that are just sort of cliches at this point.
Right.
That I feel like, it doesn't have to be like, why, like Patrick Bateman doesn't need to be the catch-all for charming, handsome, creepy guy. Like,
And Andrew Cunanan in this show has no charm.
he has no charm.
And that's a problem for me.
Even though I like the actor a lot.
I like the actor too, and I feel like he's doing the best job he can with the material.
The material.
But for me, I feel like I always want to have an uncomfortable of the villain.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And I feel like they're just selling him as this huge fucking loser.
Right.
Where it's like he got somewhere because of some kind of charm he might have had, even if people found him out eventually.
Right.
But we're not seeing any of that.
And that's what people have to realize is that, like, that's what makes serial killers and predators, one of the things so frightening is because they can be anyone. Because
they're likable in some way.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they have enough charisma to con people in this way.
I feel like we talked about this in the Gianni Versace episode we did, that Ryan Murphy was really trying to play up that this was some kind of gay conspiracy or like conspiracy against gay people. Like as far as the cops go. And I feel like this episode, they're really pushing that element a bit with his relationship with his boyfriend. Like almost really selling home the point like, hey, not all gay people are promiscuous. And these two really loved each other and the boyfriend, which is fine. But it was like, did we really need a whole episode to kind of get that across? Because they have the whole scene where he's like fucking the other guys while Versace is working. Right. And then it was like at the end, they go to the club to like pick up guys again. And he's like, no, I want to. Do you know what I mean?
I just don't know what this show wants to be. Is it about Versace's life or is it about Andrew Cunanan?
Right. It's just all over the place.
I don't feel like their stories mesh well together because they didn't know each other.
Right.
So it doesn't make sense how I would have done the show because obviously that's so easy for me to say since I didn't put my blood, sweat, and tears into writing and directing and producing this show. How I, if in my perfect idea of what I thought the show should be like, I would have thought it would have been better to have it be a linear retelling of the story and to just focus on Andrew Cunanan because
he's the mystery.
Yeah, he's the compelling part. Not that, Versace's life is compelling in its own right.
Right, but the story of his murder is only interesting from Andrew Cunanan's point of view because we don't know him. We don't know him.
Right.
I don't mind if they had started off with the murder and then it flashes back to the beginning.
Yeah, I don't mind that either.
And, certainly I would be interested in any fantasy he had about Versace or knowing him or having met him. All of those things they kind of touched on throughout the first 2 episodes.
Yeah.
But yeah. Also, I feel like we still haven't gotten to any of the crimes that happened before Versace. I mean, there was the scene, I guess, where he stole the car, but that was sort of vague. But we haven't, I think even like there was like a news story where someone said something like the murder of the guy in Chicago.
Yeah.
But we haven't, I mean, there's like a real story here that happened in order, murders that happened before.
Right.
And I'm guessing we're going to get to them, but it's just a confusing way.
It's confusing to people who don't know the story.
Right. Are they going to be shocked when all of a sudden there was like 4 other murders that happened previous? I don't know. It is a weird thing. The Versace focus, I think, is misguided at this point.
I just don't, it takes me out of the story almost when, not that I don't care about Versace's life.
I do too.
It just takes me out of this story. But I also think that, like you said before, there isn't anything, Andrew Cunanan isn't menacing enough, or he doesn't scare me enough in this.
Right. He's not scary enough. And I feel like that's because we don't know what he's done yet, technically, in this show. Like we know if we have any knowledge of the case. But yeah, he's not scary enough and he's not likable enough. There's like nothing. And then the scene with the older man.
That was the only
creepy
scene that I liked in this episode. I did like that scene because it was really creepy. And I think they did a good job with it where you're not sure, is he going to kill this guy or not?
I got really scared when he stabbed a hole in the tape.
I did too. I
thought
was
like,
going to start bleeding.
How did you just do that?
Right.
I mean, that was pretty strategic. Like, that was a good move.
It was creepy. That was a good scene.
That was a good scene, and Easy Lover was playing.
Right.
But then the guy, I also was unsure if that really happened. Although I do know from my research when I did that episode, he was very involved in that scene.
In the BDSM.
In the BDSM scene. And it kind of had pushed the envelope, or pushed the line, not envelope,
That's
a little bit too much.
Where he'd get a little too zealous.
So maybe that was sort of a call from that. The other thing I did like sometimes is the music. It's always like very retro for me to hear like Lisa Stansfield. Do you know what I mean? Like,
no,
it's
I know what you mean.
But sometimes I think with Ryan Murphy things, and I always like, we were talking about this a bit before, I'm always very into his subject matters, but I don't like the execution of them sometimes.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the case with this one. Like there's these elements that you kind of like the music and the look.
Right.
There's like the nostalgia that's sort of like fun.
Right. Right.
But ultimately, I'm going to finish watching this series.
We're going to do it. We're going to recap the episodes. This is a shorter recap this week because we have a long...
And nothing really happened this week, really, right?
No, this is such a crazy story. Andrew Cunanan's story is so crazy that I feel like I'm...
When this ended, I was like, that's it. It felt like the cold open was the whole show, kind of.
Right. And it was a 10-minute cold open, too.
Right.
I don't know.
It's a mess.
It was not good for me.
I feel like the OJ one was done so much better. Even though that was cheesy and funny and had all those kind of elements too, it was just much more compelling and well done, the narrative.
It was tense. And I know the OJ story.
Right.
So, but that, for some reason, the OJ one I thought was brilliant. I mean, I watched every moment of it. I loved every moment of it. I was riveted by it. I couldn't wait for the next week.
Well, the interesting thing, I think, like my favorite part of the OJ one is I really liked the focus on Marcia Clark's story.
Me too.
Because that's sort of something I don't think you really knew if you followed OJ. I mean, you might have known some of it, but it was like a good thing to see.
It was good.
And this one where it's like, who are we rooting for here? Like, obviously, yes, Versace gets murdered. He's but I don't even feel a connection to him.
I don't either.
I don't feel like a connection to anybody.
I don't either.
Rooting against or for
at
this point. And that's weird to me.
I mean, and Marcia was such a good example of someone to root for who really was a focal point in the OJ series because they humanized her and she had never been humanized. She wasn't allowed to be human. I mean, I
cried during some of her moments.
Oh my God.
It was really upsetting.
It was great.
So I don't feel like that connection yet.
I don't either. So and maybe third time's a charm. We'll give it next week. We'll see what happens, what he does with it.
I mean, I do give Ryan Murphy credit for getting a little butt fucking on screen.
I was very happy to see that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So,
and we also discovered that Brendan used to like the song Gloria when he was a little kid.
Oh, I mean, it's a great song.
Yeah.
So that was when Andrew was singing, right? In the car?
He was singing it in the car.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't like those kind of moments and things like, oh, like I feel like that was like, let's humanize him, but it was a little shallow, right?
Yeah.
Like he's just a dork who sings Gloria at the top of his lungs in the car.
Well, the other thing that really irritated me, like I said before, there was like a few blatant sort of like too much of like rip off of like a Patrick Bateman aesthetic, where he was in the club. Andrew Cunanan's in the club in this one scene, and the guy's like, "What do you do?" And he goes, "I'm a serial killer."
And then he's like re-says it, but it's like it doesn't even sound similar. He's like, "Actually, I'm a fashion student." Like it wasn't something like that sounded like it.
It just was dumb. And then
he's not a serial killer in my mind.
He's a spree killer, and there's a difference.
I'll fucking mansplain you.
I will serial killer explain you all day. He is a spree killer technically.
Right.
So the other thing that he said in that scene, he said, "I'm going to be the most likely to be remembered," which it was cheesy, but it would have been more powerful had we known in the series that was what he was voted for in high school. But the audience doesn't know that, so it just seems like, what?
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. You can definitely share your thoughts with us on what you think of it.
I'm curious to see what our listeners think of the show.
Friend page, Facebook friend page, right?
I don't really see a lot of people talking about it on Twitter.
So you can go there, and there's other fun discussions going on, and people share stories and cases that we should talk about, and cases we have talked about.
Right.
So let's get to
our main story.
Our main story this week.
Yeah.
I'm going back to old Hollywood, and I'm pretty sure I didn't look to see, but I'm pretty sure this might be a Hollywood Babylon story from the Kenneth Anger. Anger?
I always said Anger.
Book. Anyways, this is going old school again, because we have actually been doing a lot of more recent-ish cases lately. So this is a definite old Hollywood story. It is about the director, William Desmond Taylor, who is pretty much unknown these days, but was a popular figure in the Hollywood early days, like the silent film era, 1910s to early 20s. He was a pretty mysterious guy himself, and before he came to Hollywood, he was numerous things. He was an antique dealer. He panned for gold. He was in the British and Canadian armies, maybe during World War I. He was from Ireland, but he kind of had this persona of the genteel English gentleman.
Yeah.
So he kind of was sprucing himself up a bit. There's nothing wrong with that. He was pretty much described in a lot of the things I said as sort of a liar, like someone who was not exactly 100% forthcoming.
Yeah.
He was many things. He was a deadbeat dad. He was a drifter. He flocked to Hollywood in these early days of Hollywood. And I think if you listen to our Fatty Arbuckle story, you might recall that this was a period before celebrity scandals was really big. We didn't really know much about the actors or the people making movies. So he kind of drifted into this world. It was a scandal-free period in Hollywood, believe it or not. And much like Hollywood, he kind of reinvented himself every day. This is a person who really didn't have like a solid persona. He kind of fit in where he could and how he could. And I don't think anyone really knew him 100%. But the greatest mystery regarding William Desmond Taylor, I'm laughing because this is so cheesy and I actually wrote it, was his murder. Yes, that's a melodramatic line that I actually wrote down.
I like it.
Thank you. His murder happened on February 2nd or possibly February 1st, 1922. And the reason I'm doing it is because it is coming up on that date. So it's sort of like an anniversary of some sorts. This actually was less than a year after the Fatty Arbuckle, death of that woman, Virginia Rape or Rappe. I don't think we ever. We don't know how to say any last names. Okay. So this is. I think that happened in September because it was like Labor Day weekend. Mm-hmm. So this is February. So less than 6 months, and I think the trials were going on at this period.
Yeah.
So this is like the start. The Fatty Arbuckle started this whole sensationalized yellow journalism with the Hearst newspapers. And this was kind of a fucking double whammy. Like less than or whatever, 6 months later,
they already have a new story.
There's a new huge Hollywood scandal. But let's go back to the very beginning and get a little info on this guy. William Desmond Taylor was born William Cunningham Dean Tanner on April 26, 1872 in Carlow, Ireland. In 1890, Taylor actually left Ireland to go to a dude ranch in Kansas. This was actually a trend at the time when Irish and English immigrants were coming to America.
Like they wanted to be cowboys?
Yeah, or as they called it, gentleman farmers, which is like, what?
What?
In Kansas. At some point, he kind of became reacquainted with acting, something that he had liked a lot in growing up in school. And at that point, he moved to New York City to kind of pursue acting. While he was there, he married a woman named Ethel May Harrison. And as a couple, they were pretty big up in high society, New York. I think she might have come from some kind of money. They were involved in clubs. He was kind of known as a ladies' man and a drinker, like a real partier, but he was also sort of recognized as someone who had a dark side and sort of a depressed nature. In 1908, which I think is shortly after marrying her at the age of 36, he actually deserted his wife, and they had a young daughter at the time who I think was only 2 years old.
Damn.
After he basically disappeared at this point, which is crazy.
To be a chameleon?
Well, we'll get to that. He disappeared at this point, and friends at the time actually said that this was something he had suffered from his whole life, mental lapses. And the family thought that when he did disappear, it was just another one of his mental lapses or amnesia where he had forgotten what his life was or where he was.
Did he say that he had these mental lapses?
Exactly. His wife actually got a divorce in 1912 based on this desertion. And there's no medical condition that explains what happened with him, but he had numerous affairs and gotten into trouble his whole life. And the mental lapses always kind of coincided with him being in trouble for something.
Sounds like someone I used to know.
Right? It's like celebrities nowadays going for sex addiction.
Right.
Like it used to be called mental lapses where they just left.
Look, every Breaking Bad fan knows that the fugue state is a fucking lie.
Oh, okay. So anyways, like I said, that's what his family thought had happened when he had basically abandoned his wife and child. He vanished, and he reappeared finally in Los Angeles with a new name and English accent.
Wait, so he didn't have an English, he had an Irish accent?
No, he had an Irish accent. So he kind of reinvented himself as the stately, upper crusty English gentleman when he relocated to Los Angeles. And gone was like the Irish brogue. I don't know.
So he's like a less interesting Madonna?
Kind of. So this is when he changed his name to William Desmond Taylor and started his new life in Hollywood. Now in Hollywood, he initially got his start working as an actor in 1913. He appeared in several films, including one opposite a woman named Margaret Gibson, who was a popular screen actress or silent screen actress at the time. At some point, he started directing. He directed, I think, over 50 films, but none of them at all are anything you would remember, even if you were like the biggest film snob.
Yeah.
There's just nothing. I mean, at some point during this period, he did supposedly enlist in the Canadian Expeditionary Force and served in some capacity during World War I, but nothing is very clear on that. There was like a million things that I saw in research that he had done, but it was just like nothing major. So I don't even know if it's necessarily true, because who the hell knows with him. He was also at this point, I mean, this is how big he was at the time. He was honored by the Motion Picture Directors Association with a formal banquet for directing. Yeah. So he was like a director of note. Like, even though we don't know who he is, he was pretty big at the time. He worked with like numerous popular stars who you probably do know, including Mary Pickford, Wallace Reed, and one of his big films was Anne of Green Gables, which starred Mary Miles Minter, who we will be coming back to later in this story, as well as the first person I mentioned, Margaret Gibson. So he seems kind of like weird and dickish up until this point, like maybe like old school fuckboy or something. But he did have sort of some nice side to him that were sort of brought to my attention through my research. His ex-wife and daughter actually did find him again by seeing him in a film called Captain Alvarez as an actor. And according to the thing I read, his wife Ethel, while watching the movie, said, "That's your father."
I hope she was like, "That's your father."
That's your father, by the way. And then she wrote to the studio trying to get in touch with him. And Taylor at that point did go to New York City and met his daughter and started to try to build a relationship with her and made her his legal heir. So I guess he kind of started taking care.
Kind of.
He also had someone from his brother's family at the time turn up at his doorstep, broke, and he promised that he would pay that person. I think it was the ex-wife or wife. I think the brother also abandoned his wife in a similar fashion, by the way. And he said, "I will pay you $50 a month until my death." The other thing, he was very close to an actress, Mabel Normand, who you might remember was also someone who worked with Fatty Arbuckle. She was heavily into drugs, including opium. And he was very good friend to her and was trying to help her kick her drug habit, and even went so far as to kind of fight with her drug dealers. So his career was going pretty well. He, had a pretty good life going in Los Angeles. He had money. But at some point, as you might have known, because he gets murdered, his luck runs out.
Like, when's this coming?
Wait, what? And on February 2nd, 1922, he was found dead in his Westlake Park bungalow. Do you know where Westlake Park is?
Isn't that by like Langers?
Yeah, it's by like MacArthur Park. Right.
Yeah.
So it's sort of in between like Filipino town and Koreatown. Like,
yeah.
It's in, but it's just north of MacArthur Park.
Right.
It took so long to bake it. Sorry.
I don't think I'll have the recipe again.
I don't know. That's an amazing song.
One of my all-time favorite
It's
songs.
a great song.
The full 17-minute version.
It's insane. Yeah. Okay.
The best.
So, as I mentioned earlier, this happened after the whole Fatty Arbuckle scandal went down, and Hollywood was literally reeling from this sort of, the newspapers selling them as this fucking gutter of sin and like sex and like crime and just
drinking
and
up
until this point, you have to realize there was nothing. It's not like it is now with TMZ.
Right.
At this point, it was nothing, and all of a sudden, it was like you had like the mothers against like protesting Hollywood, and people were up in arms, just being like really puritanical. This is also during Prohibition, so it was like these people are drinking and partying. It was just all a negative thing. So Hollywood was freaking the fuck out, because obviously they're making a ton of money, and the last thing they need to do is have their biggest stars or anyone go down in flames. Taylor was 49 when he was murdered. At the time, he was also the head of the Motion Pictures Directors Association. So he was pretty up there as far as being a representative of Hollywood. And he was also, like I said, had that reputation as being a Brit. So he had sort of, he wasn't like Fatty Arbuckle, who were kind of vulgar and known to be kind of more lower class, I guess.
Yeah.
So this was like a especially big blow. And like I said before, William Randolph Hearst was exploring the fuck out of this story, as well as the Fatty Arbuckle thing. And so here's the rundown of kind of what we know that led up to his body being found. On February 1st, which is the night before his body was found, the director was meeting with his friend, Mabel Normand. According to a neighbor, and I don't know how, actually Mabel was interviewed after the murder, so this is how we have some of this information. They were drinking orange blossom gin cocktails, which sound amazing. She dropped by to his apartment actually to pick up 2 books. One was a study on Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. I don't know how to say that. And at that point, they started talking about various things that Taylor was sort of worried about, things that were on his mind. One of which was his ex-valet or secretary, a man named Edward Sands, had disappeared after forging his checks. And his butler, a man named Henry Peavy, had been arrested recently for soliciting young boys in the park, and he had to bail him out of jail.
Wow.
Okay. So Mabel also retrieved a copy of Freud's interpretation of dreams, and she left with those 2 books. And that was about 7:45 p.m. that night. He walked her to her car. He left his door unlocked to the Alvarado Street bungalow, according to her. He kind of just left the door open, walked her to the car, which was a chauffeur-driven car. They blew kisses at each other, blah, 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 blah. And so with the exception of whoever murdered him, Mabel Normand is on record as being the last person to see him alive. So he returned to his apartment about 8 p.m. His neighbors, a woman named Faith McLean and her husband, said that about 8 p.m. they heard a car backfire. They went to the window and they saw what they thought was a man in a long coat wearing like a scarf wrapped around his head and a collar turned up and a plaid cap sort of covering that person's face, leaving his apartment and kind of casually just, walking out as if he had just forgotten something. Like it was not like a rush, suspicious thing. She just heard the backfire and saw this person who she didn't know leaving the apartment. Later, she said the person had, this is a quote, effeminate walk and was funny looking, also a quote. More than a decade later, actually, during a grand jury testimony, when pressed for more information, she said she couldn't be certain if it was actually a man that she saw. Another neighbor, Hazel Gillon, stated that she also saw a dark figure after hearing the car backfire. I think which was especially noticeable because it was like a really quiet street. It's actually like Alvarado Street, which to me is not a quiet street, but I guess maybe it was back then.
It was probably.
And there was nothing. It was quiet all night.
Yeah.
Until 7:30 a.m. And that was when the houseman, or butler, I've heard a few things that he's been called, Henry Peavy, arrived and found William's body lying dead in the living room. Apparently, Peavy screamed and ran out into the courtyard, and chaos basically immediately ensued. It was actually Peavy called the studio before he called the police, which I think the studio that Taylor worked for was Paramount Studios.
Peavy didn't want to call the police after what he'd just been through.
Taylor was lying in a pool of blood, but at that point, they didn't really know what had happened. The investigation and the whole scene from the start was basically like chaos and a circus. As I said, before the police arrived, there was already a crowd of people descending on the place and in the crime scene. A crowd had gathered inside, and actually someone identified himself as a doctor and made an examination of the body and declared that Taylor had died of a stomach hemorrhage.
What?
The doctor was never seen again at this point. Some people speculate that he was embarrassed by the diagnosis.
What, some guy just comes up in the crowd like,
is there a doctor in the house? At some point when the investigators came, they rolled the body over, and it was quite obvious that he had been shot through the back with a small caliber pistol, which was not at the scene. So this guy literally did nothing to examine him, but just saw him in a pool of blood on his stomach, I guess, and assumed. But why would you hemorrhage? You don't hemorrhage from your stomach that way. Like, it's insane. The other, as I mentioned before, like the police weren't called until 12 hours after he probably died. And as I said, like Paramount Studios was called before even the police were called.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of speculation going on that Paramount wanted to get to the scene first and destroy any evidence or anything that would make him look, in a poor light.
Like a vibrator or something?
Yeah, all of his dildos and his whole butt plug collection was burned in a fire.
That's what I'm saying. Like, when I think of things that'll incriminate him, delete his
Some of the things
history.
that they think they burned were letters, which I'll get into a little later, ladies' lingerie, illegal booze, and stuff like that. Because like I said, prohibition. So they're looking for things that would make him look sinister in any way. Like, it's much better for them if it's like an innocent victim, whatever.
Especially with all the Fatty Arbuckle stuff that's happening.
Right. So there's even speculation that Paramount instructed Peavy to clean up the blood in the apartment, but I didn't see like a lot of evidence of that. But basically the scene is chaos. Another interesting fact at this point, only after he was murdered did people in Hollywood find out that he his name wasn't really William Desmond Taylor. They found out his whole previous life and that his real name was William Cunningham Dean Tanner.
Busted.
And they found out all about, you know, his life,
with
all
his
of his
kid
life and his kid. Yeah, yeah.
abandoned.
So none of that was known to people he knew in Hollywood. It was like a complete surprise. And at the time, it was a big thing in the newspapers too, because it added this extra, like, who is this guy? Like,
well, that would be a weird thing today if some celebrity
Right.
we knew today, a modern celebrity, was murdered, and then you find out, oh, by the way, that's not even their real name. They had this whole other life and family.
right. Well, the name change we usually know.
Yeah,
like,
we do.
yeah.
Right.
So if it was like something we didn't know and then it was attached to this whole other
Right.
second life, that would be weird. Now, like I said before, the studio would love for it to just be an innocent victim situation, but the robbery motive just didn't line up and was ruled out almost immediately.
There wasn't anything taken from the house.
Right. In his pockets, he had a wallet with $78 in cash. He had a silver cigarette case, a really nice pocket watch, a pen
want a silver
knife.
cigarette case.
I know, right? And he even had like a locket with Mabel Normand's photograph in it. There was also a 2-carat diamond ring on his finger. So with all of that evidence, it seemed pretty clear that robbery was not the motive. One suspicious thing, which I will get into later, was a large sum of cash had been drawn from his accountant the day before, and at that point was missing and wasn't accounted for. It wasn't in his house anywhere, so no one knew where that cash was. But police quickly kind of jumped to thinking it was a crime of passion. That was sort of their initial thought. There was a lot of rumors at that time swirling around, including the relation to Mabel Normand's drug dealers. And as I said before, he had the connection to that butler or PV. So there was like the sex perversion kind of angle being explored. And then another interesting thing I thought was interesting, there was also people even making are alleging that Taylor was a part of occult practices and a member of the Ordo Templis Orientis cult, which was started by Satanist Aleister Crowley.
Cool.
I know. I was like, more of this, please. And I guess there was, you know, someone had seen Taylor in opium dens, and in those dens, men smoked the pipe and had sex with each other. So some people were speculating it was and this is a quote, a homosexual revenge killing. Okay.
Damn.
Yeah. So, I mean, who knows?
As opposed to regular old heterosexual revenge killing.
Yeah, a homosexual.
There's like a huge difference.
There's always something very loaded when someone uses the word homosexual. Like it
totally.
always seems like
it just
homosexual.
He was a homosexual.
Yeah, it's very,
Yeah, it's not good.
So, you know, this is a huge media circus, obviously. At the time, a Los Angeles undersheriff named Eugene Biscalis warned a reporter, and this is a quote coming from the sheriff's department, not Hollywood. The industry has been hurt. Stars have been ruined. Stockholders have lost millions of dollars. A lot of people are out of jobs and incensed enough to take a shot at you. So it's like, you know, something we're all familiar with. People threatening the media with accusations of fake news. Robert Giroux, who wrote a book on this case, here's a quote from him. The studio seemed to be fearful that if certain aspects of the case were exposed, it would exacerbate their problems. And King Vidor, who was a director during Hollywood early days, a famous director, he kind of became obsessed with the case.
Yeah.
And there's another famous book that's written based on a lot of his research. It's not written by him, but the person who wrote it used his research. In 1968, he said, "Last year, I interviewed a Los Angeles police detective, now retired, who had been assigned to the case immediately after the murder. He told me we were doing all right, and then before a week was out, we got word to lay off." So in addition to the Fatty Arbuckle trial, there was also some famous drug addictions happening at the time, including Wallace Reed and Mary Pickford's brother, Jack. There was another death by poison of an actress named Olive Thomas, who was married to Jack Pickford. So like I said before, the women's clubs and religious groups were already up in arms. And when this murder happened, it makes sense that maybe the Los Angeles Police Department were being kind of, you know, encouraged to just lay off and maybe not do much regarding investigating the crime. And as far as, you know, I can tell, the murder was kind of just swept under the rug. I mean, it is a cold case to this day. It's never been solved.
Can I just say that it would just fucking suck to be murdered in like 1930 or whatever.
Right before there's really any way to gather evidence or
when people are just walking around with like magnifying glasses and shit.
Well, as much as the cops pushed it under the rug or whatever, amateur sleuths and old Hollywood fanatics definitely kept this case going. And as I mentioned before, King Vidor, and then obviously with the advent of the internet, things kind of went next level with a lot of this.
Really?
Yeah. So I'm going to get into now suspects. And there are a lot of them.
New suspects.
Well, these are all people involved in the case from the get-go, but people... so there's a lot of them. Yeah. Like there's a lot of suspects. I'm going to focus in on a few of them.
Okay.
So we're only getting started here. Sorry. I hope you're interested. There was over a dozen people who were eventually named as suspects by the press and the police, who were questioned initially by the police because they did do a cursory investigation.
Right.
Like it just was very in-depth and kind of left alone. The first person I mentioned is Edward Sands, and that was William Desmond Taylor's valet before Peavy. Edward Sands is regularly described as a sociopath. His real name was Edward Snyder, and he's actually someone who also pretended to be British. He had a Cockney accent, but he was actually born in Ohio.
Really?
Yeah. So before Sands worked for William Desmond Taylor, he had a long history of fraud, embezzlement, forging checks. I mean, just a whole litany of fucking crimes along those kind of lines, like really small, petty theft, embezzlement.
He's not a very honest person.
No, he's a scam artist. He was hired at some point by Taylor. One of the articles I read was like, this was before you could check out people's criminal history for like a job, clearly. And he was pretty devoted to Taylor, actually. There was no problems the first year. One person said that he seemed to adore William, and he even offered William to be his slave for life, which honestly seems like a red flag to me.
Wow.
So in 1921, like I said, the first year was sort of without incident. In 1921, Taylor took a trip to Europe, and that was when Sands forged his first check from William. It was for $5,000. He also stole...
That's a lot of money.
Right? He also stole and wrecked Taylor's car while he was in Europe. He stole jewelry. He stole Russian gold-tipped cigarettes, which sound amazing to me.
Oh, my God.
In fact, Taylor at some point came home and found those cigarettes crushed on the front porch like someone had smoked them.
That's so rude.
Right.
If you're going to steal the cigarettes, at least be like sly about it.
Right. I think at some point he maybe let Sands go, and he found the cigarettes on the porch, so he knew that Sands had come back to the bungalow without his permission.
And put him back.
Yeah, so it was like a clear
this guy's
fuck
fucking
you. Yeah.
Bold.
At some point, Sands also mailed pawn tickets for the jewelry that he had stolen from Taylor back to Taylor, and he mailed them under Taylor's real name, William C. Dean Tanner, with a note that said, "So sorry to inconvenience you, even temporarily. Also observe the lesson of the forced sale assets. A Merry Christmas and a happy, prosperous New Year's, alias Jimmy V." So handwriting analysis confirmed that it was written by Sands, but it's more importantly, it kind of shows that Sands knew his real name.
He knew he
knew Taylor's real name, so he mailed this to him with his real name.
Yeah, it's like a threat.
It's a threat. One of Taylor's friends, a woman named Julia Crawford Ivor, said, "There was never a more devoted man serving another man than this man Sands during the first year and a half of his service for Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor trusted him with everything. Sands read everything he could find. He used to study into the late hours of the night. And when Mr. Taylor told me of the various actions attributed to him, we all decided the man must have become deranged."
Well, it's a red flag when somebody says, "I will be your slave and devoted to you."
Totally.
In that circumstance.
So before the murder, Taylor had some troubling phone calls, like people calling him late at night and hanging up. It seemed like to him that someone was checking to see if he was home. The night before his murder, I mentioned that he asked for $5,000 in cash that he kept and was never found after his death. And that's one of the main things that people think indicate that Sands was the murderer, because I think they're assuming that he was being blackmailed by Sands to not reveal his identity. Right. Although he wasn't like a criminal, so I don't know why he would be that concerned about having his real name come out, unless he was just embarrassed or humiliated by that fact.
I think it was just sort of a symbol of sort of ownership. Like, I know you, I know your secrets.
Right.
Not necessarily that he had a criminal past, but whatever skeletons he had in his closet.
And maybe 5,000 wasn't that much for him.
Yeah.
Now, he did have an alibi, actually. He had signed into work at a lumber yard in Oakland, California on the day of the murder. So that's sort of evidence pointing in his innocence, or in the direction of his innocence. Now, there are reports that Sands was actually found dead from a suicide in Connecticut shortly after that. But the district attorney at the time kept it a secret from the press to throw suspicion away from people who were in the movie industry, because this guy was not related to the movie industry.
Right.
So he was basically continuing a manhunt for someone who was already dead. That's the speculation, that this guy had committed suicide, and this guy was still acting, the district attorney was still acting like they're searching for the killer, just to kind of deflect.
Like how OJ's like, I'm going to keep searching for the killer.
Which is a crazy theory. And there's no evidence of that being true. It's something I read. Don't at me. Okay, that's the first suspect. The second suspect is the butler, Henry Peavy. The butler did it. Hey. I love that there's a butler for an apartment, a bungalow. Yeah. Like, it doesn't seem
That's so
right.
extra.
But maybe that's just the name. Yet it's very extra. So Henry Peavy was the man who was hired after Sands was finally kind of officially fired for stealing and whatnot. He is also the person, as I said before, who found Taylor's body. Some of the things that, by the way, Peavy was black, and a lot of the newspaper stories were about his flashy golf costumes and his saying that he wore this stuff but didn't play golf. He, like I said before, he had a criminal record and had been arrested shortly before the murder, I think 3 days, for social vagrancy and lewd and dissolute behavior.
Was it just that he was picking up men, or were they young boys?
No. There's like a lot of uncertainty with all these things, because who knows how people over extra charges,
that's what I'm
right?
saying, is
like gay charges, I feel like anything gay related at that period in time was just considered the most perverted and deviant thing ever. He was charged with indecent exposure, but that can be almost anything at that time. It could be cruising in like a public, like a gay cruising area or whatever. It could also just be peeing outside or being in a whites only bathroom. There was also some speculation that Peavy was either Taylor's lover or was perhaps procuring boys for him. But like I said, this is like a big tabloid story, so there's just like a lot of misinformation, and sort of people are always going to go for that kind of lewd and lascivious type behavior that they think is going to be whatever, sell newspapers. So according to this quote by, I can't remember, where is it? Oh, okay. This is a really good story. Sorry. Even though the police decided after questioning that he was definitely not the murderer, there was a correspondent from the New York Daily News named Floribel Muir, and she came to her own conclusion that he was the murderer, but there's for no reason.
She's just like, I have a feeling.
She's like a feisty woman reporter who's going to break some big case, basically. So she came up with like the most harebrained scheme I've ever fucking heard of. She thought that she was going to trick Peavy into confessing. In her mind, and it's said that she learned this from the movies, blacks were deathly afraid of ghosts. What? This is her reasoning behind her plan. This is not my theory or why I'm saying this is not my opinion. In her opinion, blacks were deathly afraid of ghosts. So, I'm sorry. With the help of two men, one was named Frank Carson, one was named Al Weinstein.
Don't tell me.
She offered Peavy $10 if he would go with her to Hollywood Park Cemetery, where he was buried, to help her identify where Taylor's grave was.
If these two...
Okay.
Okay. Can I just say what I think's going to happen?
Well, I mean, it's very clear what's going to happen.
But I'm saying if they're wearing sheets, if they're wearing bed sheets, I'm going to be so upset right now.
Well, you're prepared to be upset.
Okay.
Okay, so Wineshank went ahead with a white sheet. And Muir and Carson drove with Peavy to the gravesite. Wineshank actually came from like a very tough area of Chicago, so he kind of had a very different accent.
Well, his name is Wineshank.
Right, than William Taylor did. So he did at some point come across the group wearing the white sheet.
And he's in a Chicago accent?
And in a Chicago accent, he cried out, "I am the ghost of William Desmond Taylor. You murdered me. Confess, Peavy."
Shut the fuck up.
To Henry Peavy's credit, he laughed out loud. He lulled. Then he cursed them the fuck out, which is great. So as said before, Muir did not realize that Taylor had a very distinct British accent, and Wineshank, as I said before, had like the voice of a hoodlum. And he's actually one of the Chicago mobsters who were later gunned down in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. So
Really?
That's how much of a gangster voice this guy had. I mean, this is like unbelievably stupid. Wow. So yeah, that was her big attempt. That's like more embarrassing than Geraldo opening Al Capone's vault. Right?
It's
like,
up there, yeah.
It's pretty insane, right? Like it's like out of a bad Scooby-Doo comic or something.
With the sheets on
the sheet, like come
eyes.
on. Sadly, Peavy did die in 1931, which is about 10 years later in a San Francisco asylum.
In 1931?
Right. And he had syphilis-related dementia. Okay, so Mabel Normand is the next subject we're going to get into. As I mentioned before, she was a popular comedic actress at the time. She worked a lot with Charlie Chaplin and Fatty Arbuckle. According to Robert Giroux, who wrote the book on William Taylor, Taylor was really in love with Mabel Normand. She trusted him so much that she approached him to help her with her cocaine dependency and opioid dependency. Based on her statements to the investigation and to the investigators, she relapsed a lot, and this was really hard for Taylor because he did care for her. So, I'm sure, as you know, watching someone repeatedly relapse and go back and forth is really difficult. Probably at that time too, there wasn't really programs,
what year was
right?
this?
21.
Oh yeah.
So there's
it
nothing.
Wasn't invented till
it's
35.
all on your own, basically, or maybe you have a doctor helping you.
You're still going
right?
to sanitariums,
right?
At that point.
At some point after this, he did get frustrated, and he actually met with federal prosecutors to kind of see what he could do about maybe filing charges against her suppliers, which is a pretty crazy, bold move, right?
Yeah.
But at the time, it's like, what else are you going to do?
Well, yeah, like you just said, there wasn't any treatment facilities then.
So a lot of people speculate that his going to the police or going to federal prosecutors to try to do this is maybe what led to a contract killer assassinating the director. Although Mabel Normand was interviewed as a suspect, I don't think anyone seriously thought she actually did it, but it was maybe connected to her and her lifestyle and the people she knew through the drug addiction.
I mean, couldn't you just get cocaine from a pharmacy back then?
I don't know.
Can someone write us in? And
I mean, it might have been legal, but you could still have been addicted. But I guess if he's going to prosecutors, then it must have. Well, prohibition. Would they have Would they have not done cocaine? I don't know.
I guess if she was an alcoholic. Please
cocaine
tell
explain us. We want to know.
I want to know.
So she was subjected to a grueling interrogation, as I said, and it pretty much ruled her out as a suspect. But anyways, for the rest of her life, her career kind of slowed after that. She never really had a big career in talkies.
Yeah.
Her addiction was revealed at some point, so the audience kind of didn't really have sympathy for her, and especially as a woman at that time, if you're known as a drug addict, I mean, in Hollywood, forget it. It was pretty much done.
Still to this day, forget it.
It was basically considered a moral failing, and I feel like that's bullshit, and it still kind of is seen that way.
It's still seen that way, even though it is bullshit.
At his funeral, apparently, she wept inconsolably. So they were very close.
He cared about her.
And she died actually of tuberculosis in 1930. So 9 years later, I think she was pretty young. I think she might have been 38. Apparently her last words, which were actually a few days before she died, were said to her friend Julia Brew, "Julia, do you think they'll ever find out who killed Bill Taylor?" So that's a pretty sad end.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're getting into some other stuff.
Yeah.
The next suspect on our list is an actress. I mentioned her before. She played Anne of Green Gables, or she was in Anne of Green Gables that he directed.
Right.
Her name was Mary Miles Minter, and she was a child star and a teen screen idol. And her career had basically been guided by Taylor early on. He was sort of a mentor to her. She was the classic abandoned by a father. And so she meets this director who had a daughter who was 3 years older than her. So it was sort of like both of them having this father-daughter relationship.
Right.
On his part, from all I can tell, it was completely an innocent thing. She was a bit infatuated with him, though, and wanted more.
She wanted a daddy.
She wanted a daddy, like old school daddy.
Yeah.
Daddy. Love letters were some of the things that were found in his bungalow after the murder from Mary.
I'm sorry, how old was she again?
At the time of his murder, she was 19 years old. Okay. And he was 49. So this was another thing that reporters made a lot of hay out of.
Yeah.
Because that's a pretty significant age difference. And you're just finding these love letters. You're not really investigating what he did at that point because you want it to be true, right?
Of course.
According to the letters, or based on the letters, according to her, it would have started when she was 17. So that's a little more sketch.
Yeah.
Robert Giroux and King Veeder, both of the people I've mentioned before who were heavily involved investigating this crime on an amateur sort of sleuth level, they both dispute the allegation that those two had an affair. They really think that this was an unrequited love
like
by the teenager.
Thing.
Yeah. And he actually often said that he refused to see her. He told numerous people that he was constantly telling her, "I'm too old for you," etc. So while being interviewed by police 5 days after his body was found, Mary Miles Minter said that following the murder, a friend of hers, who was a director and actor named Marshall Nealon, told her that Taylor had made several highly delusional statements about some of his social acquaintances, including her, during the weeks before his death. And she said that Naylor thought that Taylor had recently become insane. So that seems a little bit self-serving to me. So like I said, these passionate letters to Taylor from Minter were found in his apartment. They were printed in newspapers, and they pretty much shattered her screen image as well, because she was sort of known as this innocent, sort of modest, wholesome girl.
Yeah.
And here she is sort of
fawning
seeming
over this
like
old
this sort
guy.
of like sex-hungry, whatever, Lolita. And she was really vilified in the press, which is also kind of unfair.
That's shitty.
Even if she was the stupid teen who was out of her league.
19-year-olds are stupid.
Right.
You make
I mean, it's
stupid
like
decisions.
a stupid decision.
Not that you're stupid, but you
know what I'm saying. You're inexperienced and
you make
naive.
dumber decisions when you're 19.
So on the day of the murder, actually, according to a friend, they asked Taylor how Minter was, and he answered, "She's all tonsillitis and temperament." So he knew she was a problem. Ed King, who was a special investigator with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office at the time, was interviewed by True Detective magazine in 1930, and he said that Taylor was troubled by this infatuation. At the time, King had interviewed a man named Arthur Hoyt, who was a friend of Taylor's, and according to him, this is a quote, Taylor swore Hoyt to secrecy, saying that if he could promise not to breathe it to a living soul, he would tell him something that was causing him a great deal of worry. Mr. Taylor then told Mr. Hoyt that the dearest, sweetest little girl in the world was in love with him and that he was old enough to be her father. This little girl was madly in love with him, had been to his apartment the night before, coming at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. She insisted on remaining. He had insisted on her going home, whereupon this little girl had cried and threatened that if he tried to put her out, she would scream and cause a scene. This, of course, Mr. Taylor wanted to avoid, as he had many friends in the neighborhood. He finally persuaded her to leave, driving her to her home. Mr. Taylor stated to his friend Hoyt that this little girl had become so infatuated with him that it was really becoming serious. He was worried and didn't know what to do about it. She stated that she had not seen him for a long time, the last time being on a street of Los Angeles. Mr. Taylor was in his car and she was in hers. They merely waved to each other. This statement was not true. We were able to prove that she had been in his apartment many times and had actually been there the night of the murder. Now, 3 long blonde hairs were found on Taylor's jacket and were determined by the police to be those of Mary Miles Minter, and they matched them to hairs that she had left in a hairbrush at the studio. Taylor was sort of meticulous about his clothes and hair and his jacket, like being things. So it's sort of like they speculate because the hairs were still there that it had to have happened
after
that night when he was murdered.
Right.
Because he was someone who wouldn't have left or whatever. I guess he would have
taken a
lint roller to that shit. So I mentioned that they had seen each other in the car. There was people who said that may have seen each other 2 days driving on the day of the murder. The one where they passed, and then another one where they actually got out and greeted each other. And it was in that scenario that they think Minter could have hugged him and gotten the hairs on the coat that way.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that she was there, but it was the day of. I don't know. Another book called Murder in Hollywood, Solving a Silent Screen Mystery by Charles Higham theorizes that she did visit Taylor late at night after Mabel Normand had left, and that she once again sort of threw herself at him. But this time she kind of upped the ante, and she also threatened to shoot him or herself
if he didn't fuck her.
Basically, he actually sort of hugged her to calm her down, and that he speculates that might have been when the gun accidentally went off. So he speculates that she went there just kind of not really intending to do anything, but just making a scene or threatening to get what she wanted, basically, right?
That's like the more dramatic version of, well, I'm pregnant.
Right. So there was some speculation that the bullet hole wasn't aligned between his vest and his jacket, and that powder burns indicated he was shot at close range while his arm was raised, like as if he was hugging someone.
Could have been defensive.
And it was also coming from someone who was 5 feet tall or a little over 5 feet tall. I think that they did say the person who was seen leaving that night was sort of described as being on the shorter side.
And they said that had a feminine gait.
Right. So another thing sort of backing up this theory is that Mary had done a similar thing the year before. She had a temper tantrum at her home, and she locked herself in her room with her mom's gun and fired shots, played dead. And then when the family came in and were all upset that she may have shot herself, she jumped up and laughed as if it was a huge fucking joke.
She's like the original Harold from Harold and Maude.
Right. So she had a history of kind of using the gun to sort of get attention or get what she wanted.
She was a messy bitch who lived for drama.
Yes. The fake suicide incident or whatever was actually in the Shelby family home. Shelby is the name of her mom, the last name of her mom. And it was there after the murder happened that they found a soft-nosed lead bullet, which was the same type and weight as the bullet that killed Taylor.
Wow.
And that was according to some grand jury testimony in 1937. Now, Mary did end up making 4 more films for Paramount, but she did not have her contract renewed, and she kind of just was never that great of an actress. She sort of gave up her career, married a kind of wealthy businessman, and died in wealthy obscurity in Santa Monica, California in 1984.
She lived a long life.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to Charlotte Shelby, who was Mary's mother. Charlotte Shelby was the typical stage mom. She was an ex-actress who kind of was living out her fantasy of career success through her daughter. She was very overprotective and invasive in her daughter's life, and she was not happy about her daughter's obsession with Taylor. Sidney Kirkpatrick wrote a book called Cast of Killers, which kind of goes through. That's the book that I mentioned before that was sort of written on director King Vider's notes.
Yeah.
And this is where the theory that Shelby was actually the one who dressed as a man and slipped into Taylor's bungalow, found Mary there, and that she killed Taylor at that moment in the night. Now, Shelby had a history of confronting men with a gun. Charlotte Shelby is a bad bitch, okay?
So, wait, like mother, like daughter?
Well, but she actually, I think, meant it.
I mean, like, they both used the gun.
Right, it's the same gun throughout all of this. When Mentor was a teenager, she actually became involved with another director and became pregnant by this director.
Whoa.
And Shelby apparently not only paid for the abortion, she is said to have threatened the director, whose name was James Kirkwood, with a .38 revolver. During the making of A Cumberland Romance, she also went into Mary's dressing room at the time with a Smith & Wesson revolver, and she had caught an actor in there with the daughter in like a passionate embrace and also threatened him with a gun. Blue, his name was Monty Blue. He ran out of the room and Shelby took Mary home. Later on that evening, she is said to have burst into Taylor's office and screamed, "If I ever catch you hanging around Mary again, I'll blow your goddamn brains out."
Whoa.
So just about any man who showed any interest in Mary, even if it was like Taylor, sort of a more innocent thing, she kind of brought this fucking wrath down on them, and she had the gun in anger to kind of
What was her problem?
I think she was a bitter ex-actress who saw her daughter as an investment, and she didn't want her career being ruined by any scandalous sex. And I mean, her daughter was also a teenager.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
I mean, it's a little overboard, but I don't know. In 1920, she actually did show up at Taylor's bungalow late one night with the .38 Smith & Wesson blue steel revolver, demanding to know where Mary was.
Yeah.
Mary was not there, but anyways, that's like another incident where she threatened Taylor with a gun. In 1937, Shelby was finally questioned about the Taylor case. So that's like almost 17 years later. This testimony actually came from a civil lawsuit between Shelby and her other daughter named Margaret Fillmore. So it had nothing to do with the actual case. It was a completely separate thing.
Just like, my mom's crazy.
Right. She said that she had protected Charlotte against the Taylor murder case, and that Shelby was not home the night of the murder, and she was afraid Mary would run off with Taylor, and that's why she went there to kill him. Now, obviously, Shelby denies that. She denied her daughter's accusation. But Shelby's non-family member alibi for the night of the murder was an actor named Carl Stockdale. And he also received a lifetime income from Shelby he provided his alibi, and then he happened to get a lifetime income from Shelby where he was paid $200 a month for life. So it was kind of like, well, why?
Right.
Shelby's mother and Mintner's grandmother, a woman named Julius Miles, is said to have taken the revolver and thrown it into a bayou near her plantation in Louisiana shortly after the murder.
That's a long way to drive that gun.
Right. Or maybe that's where someone had to bring it there. It's not like you're going to mail a gun in the mail, right? In Cast of Killers, the book I mentioned before, a detective and director, King Veter, revealed that the gun was later retrieved from the bayou. A former district attorney named Burren Fitz killed himself with an identical .38 Smith & Wesson revolver, which has never been found since. So there's just like all this weird stuff with the gun. Another district attorney, Asa Keyes, questioned Mary Miles Minter in 1926, asking if her mother had ever threatened to kill William Desmond Taylor. Mintner said that she did not believe her mother killed him, but she did say, not definitely. She may have said, I'll kill him, something like that. She was always going to kill somebody. Okay, so that's the end of Charlotte Shelby. Now, this is sort of like the craziest one, and this is sort of the last suspect I'm going to go into. I mentioned way back the actress Margaret Gibson.
Yeah,
okay,
I remember.
So there's a really good website if you want to go do a deep dive into this case. There's a website called Taylorology that's run by a man named Bruce Long, who is like the Taylor historian. Like, it is insane. I actually went there to get a lot of information. And I was like, this is too much for me to go into.
That's a very niche thing to be
There were
into.
hundreds of documents and he has like a newsletter. It's like a real deep dive, but it is kind of interesting. So if you want to go check it out, you should definitely check it out. And in 1996, he received an email from a man named Ray Long, who was not related to him. Long had been a neighbor of a little old woman who was sort of a recluse and sort of never had left her house, had groceries delivered, etc. This is a woman he knew as the name. Her name was Pat Lewis. She was a widow and a friend of his mother's. According to this woman, in 1964, she converted to Roman Catholicism, and at some point in her life was having a heart attack, or I guess in 1964. At the time, she asked for a priest to come so she could confess her sins.
Yeah.
At that point, there was no priest available, so she made it a, in quotes, deathbed confession, saying that she had once been a silent film actress and that she had shot and killed a man named William Desmond Taylor. Now, when Ray Long was hearing this story, he didn't know who that was. Yeah. No one did. And Long's mother revealed to him another evening that she and Pat Lewis were once watching a show on television when a story on the Taylor murder case aired, and Lewis became hysterical and said that she'd killed him and thought it was long forgotten. She was like in a panic that this story was sort of up again. According to Ray, my mother never once said a word to any of us about this incident at the time. That woman was actually Margaret Gibson.
Wow.
So she had a completely new name. Now, Gibson had a troubled life of her own at the time. She had been arrested numerous times for vagrancy and opium dealing in 1917. She had been involved in what was then called a disorderly house, which is basically a brothel. So she, at the time when she was arrested for that, she actually said she was picking up local color to be in a movie. So it was like doing research kind of thing, which is awesome. She was acquitted of that charge, but she kind of had her name out there as being sort of like not the most savory character.
Yeah.
In 1923, she was arrested again for federal felony charges that were because she was involved in some kind of blackmail and extortion ring. Those charges were also dropped. So other than the fact that they had worked together at some point, there was really no connection to why she would have murdered him. There's no there's no indication of a romance that went bad or anything like that. The only thing that could possibly be the case was that because she was involved in some blackmailing ring, and drugs, that maybe there was some connection there, whatever.
Possibly.
But it's still a crazy thing for this old woman to confess to. Okay. So overall, over 300 people across the United States at some point confessed to this murder.
Shut up.
Yeah. It was like an insane... at the time, including Max Sennett, the director I mentioned earlier.
Did they confess like a deathbed confession or just...
No, just like people, like crazy people going in, because it was a big story at the time. And Max Sennett confessed on his deathbed too as being the man in woman's clothing who shot Taylor because, according to him, he was queer and he stole Mabel by giving her drugs. So for some reason he blamed Taylor, or at least in this deathbed confession. I don't think it's accurate at all. So as I said before, the only thing we really know is that this is a cold case still.
Wow.
Like I said, most people, and according to King Veter, and I kind of go with this too, I feel like Charlotte Shelby, the mother of Mary, is probably the one who did it.
She seems the most unhinged and...
and all of the evidence seems to be pointing in her direction.
Has the gun too.
And even the Taylorology website that I mentioned kind of also hints that that's probably what most likely happened, but you should definitely go take a deep dive there if you're interested. This murder has kind of been in pop culture throughout time. Like it's sort of, even though we don't know even though we don't know the movie, it has sort of influenced things over time, including Sunset Boulevard is one of them that sort of used some things from that. Her name is Norma Desmond, so like that name is sort of an homage to that. There was a movie called Hollywood Story that sort of was a ripoff of Sunset Boulevard, but more clearly based on Taylor's movie. I don't know that movie.
Yeah.
Gore Vidal wrote a novel called Hollywood that's a fictionalized account of the murder. Do you know the Jerry Herman musical Mac and Mabel?
No.
Okay. I don't think it's one of his more famous ones. I definitely know it, but that also kind of talks about it a bit, and it's based on Max Sennett and Bernadette Peters played Mabel Normand.
Yeah.
In it. And then there is a character based on William Desmond Taylor. On the 140th anniversary of his birth, his hometown of Ireland actually established a film festival called Taylor Fest. So he is kind of one of their most famous residents or ex-residents. And then the bungalows where he was murdered were actually demolished in the 60s. So the murder location right now is basically a parking lot near Alvarado and Maryland streets. And the parking lot over the years has had a Pick and Save, an Alpha Beta supermarket. And in 2017, right now, you can find a Ross and a Dollar Tree. So not quite as glamorous as it once was.
It's not a very glamorous area of town.
So that's it. That's all my info. That was a lot, right?
That was a lot. That's a lot of suspects, too.
Right. But don't you agree it seems like the mom, right?
It's totally the mom.
I feel like it's either the drug dealers, like that. I can buy into that.
I could buy into the drug dealer
if he's
story.
really kind of going after them in a hardcore way.
Not very smart.
Right. But
there weren't a lot of gangster movies, maybe. I mean, I'm sure there were, but it wasn't like...
Although, like, drug-related deaths don't seem very old school.
Well, yeah, I mean...
But if that was, like, if you think about it, drugs back then were more mob.
Yeah, that's true.
And isn't that insane ghost story, though?
The ghost story...
When I was reading it, I was like you. I was like, this cannot be going where I think it's going.
Oh, my God. I can't believe it. And then he didn't even try and change his accent, either. He used the, like, most conspicuous accent. It's insane. So stupid. I love dumb criminal stories.
Right. That's pretty dumb.
It's so dumb.
Okay. So that's that.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Sorry. That was like long.
No, good.
I went into it thinking it was going to be a shorter one, but then it was just so much information. When I went to that website, Taylorology, I was like, oh, fuck. Like,
right now,
I was like, I'm going to find some really good juicy details. And I was like, oh, there's like, it was so overwhelming. I was like, dude, how is this guy so invested in this story? But he got that crazy confession story. So I guess it was worth it. But yeah. So we've already thanked our Patreons, but definitely follow us on social media. We'll be posting pictures.
Yes.
On Instagram
and follow us on Twitter.
And then join the Facebook group.
Yeah.
And we'll talk more, and maybe we'll share some stories from Taylorology. Okay. I like Taylorology. It's like, do you think Taylor Swift was like, hey.
Hey, guys.
Hey, guys. She's going to sue them.
That's like this guy's whole life.
I know.
That's hilarious.
You have to go check it out. I have never seen
I just imagine it like a GeoCities type
It layout. Is like literally the most basic 1990. Like the website has not changed.
That's how I imagine the layout of it.
It's insane. But yeah, we're definitely worth checking out if you're bored.
I will.
Bye.
Bye.
More taters, Mom.